Hello, and welcome to Echoes of the Forgotten Earth. A quiet place, deliberately quiet, where curiosity doesn't have to perform, where questions can take their time, where the long memory of this planet is spoken gently enough that your mind can loosen its grip on the day instead of tightening around it. Wherever you happen to be listening from tonight, maybe the room is dim, maybe the world outside your window is still bright and unfinished. I'm grateful you found your way here. Think of this as a slow walk rather than a lecture. A place to wonder without urgency, to learn without being pushed, to drift through ideas the way you drift through a familiar neighborhood at dusk, noticing a porch light you've never really seen before, hearing a bird you can't name and deciding you don't need to. Tonight we're going to sit with a puzzle that lives quietly at the center of human history. It isn't a mystery made of explosions or conspiracies. There are no secret handshakes in the shadows, no coded messages waiting to be cracked open like a safe. This puzzle is made of something softer. It's made of absence. A long stretch where we expect to hear footsteps and instead, we hear only wind. A pause so wide it can vanish into the background, because our minds are good at stepping over empty spaces and calling them nothing, even when they clearly aren't. This is the lost age. The uneasy interval between what we call prehistory and what we call civilization. If you imagine human history as a road that disappears backward into deep time, hundreds of thousands of years, most of it is marked sparingly. A few stone tools like scattered gravel, hearths like faint campfire rings, small groups moving across landscapes that were harsher than the ones many of us live inside now. Long seasons, thin margins, a world that could be generous, but did not guarantee anything. And then, without much warning, the road changes. Not gradually, not politely. Permanent settlements appear. Agriculture takes root. Monumental structures rise in stone and earth. Writing shows up. Mathematics, astronomy, organized religion, layered social hierarchies. So many of the defining features of civilization gather in a surprisingly narrow window of time, as if they've been waiting behind a door and someone finally turned the handle. The strange part is not that these things happened. Given the minds we carry in our skulls, it isn't shocking that we eventually built cities and calendars and temples and tallies. The strange part is how little evidence we have of learning to do it. Civilization, when it enters the record, often enters like an adult walking on stage. Already capable, already coordinated, already relying on planning and shared knowledge that feels as though it came from somewhere just out of sight. That doesn't mean anything supernatural occurred. It doesn't require lost super machines or a vanished golden empire hiding beneath the sand, at least not as a default explanation. But it does raise a calm question that refuses to leave. What happened during the stretch of time we don't seem able to fully account for? As we move through this together, I'm not going to ask you to accept extraordinary claims without evidence. And I'm also not going to rush past the uncomfortable thinness in the story just because it makes us restless. The goal here isn't to replace one rigid narrative with another. It's to slow down enough to notice where the narrative itself becomes fragile, where assumptions quietly substitute for missing information, where the past might still be holding details we haven't learned to read properly yet. Before we go any further, let me ask something small, not to derail us, but to anchor us. Where are you listening from right now? And what time is it there? Not in the official sense, not according to atomic clocks or global standards, but in the personal sense. Is it late enough that the day feels finished? Early enough that the world still feels unopened? Somewhere between? It's a simple question, but it fits, because so much of what we're about to explore depends on how humans relate to time, how we store it, how we lose it, how we pretend it's continuous even when it breaks. If this kind of slow exploration feels calming or intriguing or simply like a good way to let your mind settle as the day releases its grip, you're welcome to stay close to this channel. Subscribe if you'd like. It helps this quiet corner of curiosity reach others who might want to take the long way through big questions. There's no hurry though. Everything we're talking about tonight has already waited thousands of years. It can wait a little longer. So, let's ease into the deeper story. For the vast majority of our existence as a species, humans lived in what we loosely call prehistory. That label doesn't mean nothing happened. It only means there are no written records left behind to narrate those events for us in direct sentences. What we have instead are bones and tools, soot and soil, dwellings that leave only shadows in the ground, art in caves, and subtle marks on landscapes shaped by repeated use. It's a kind of history written without words, and it stretches back farther than most people realize. Anatomically modern humans have been here for at least 300,000 years. Pause for that number. Let it sit. 300,000 years is so long that it resists imagination. It's long enough for coastlines to redraw themselves, for climates to swing between extremes again and again, for mountain faces to soften and collapse in slow motion. And within that enormous span, what we usually call civilization occupies only the thinnest slice near the present, so thin you could miss it if you blinked at the wrong scale. For hundreds of thousands of years, humans lived without agriculture, without permanent stone architecture, without writing, without metal. But they were not passive. They were not dull. They were not waiting to become intelligent. They adapted to deserts and forests, tundra and coasts. They survived ice ages. They crossed continents. They developed language complex enough to coordinate hunting and teaching, to transmit stories and warnings, to carry humor and grief. They painted cave walls. They buried their dead with care. None of that speaks of mental limitation. And yet, for tens of thousands of years, the material footprint of human societies changes slowly. Stone tools improve, but in measured steps. Shelters become more refined, but remain temporary. Food is gathered and hunted rather than grown. Populations remain comparatively small. Technology stays portable. Life is mobile, flexible, woven tightly into local ecosystems. There is ingenuity here, but it is shaped for survival and adaptability, not for accumulation and permanence. Then something shifts. Around 12,000 years ago, give or take, depending on region, humans in multiple places begin to settle down. They begin domesticating plants and animals. They build structures meant to last beyond a season. They organize labor beyond the needs of a single family. They mark territory, define ownership, and develop ways of storing surplus. Within a few thousand years, writing appears. Formal mathematics emerges. Trade networks stretch far. Monumental architecture rises, sometimes aligned with celestial cycles that require careful observation over generations. In geological terms, it's almost instantaneous. And that brings us back to the same quiet question. Not why humans eventually built civilizations, but why it happened so quickly, and why the steps leading up to it are so hard to trace. If you studied the development of most complex systems, biological or technological, you'd expect a long runway. Early prototypes that are clumsy, many failed attempts, gradual refinement, a visible learning curve. In many areas of human innovation, that's exactly what we see. But in the transition from mobile foraging societies to full-scale civilizations, the runway can feel oddly short. This gap has been noticed for a long time, though it's often smoothed over in simplified timelines. Textbooks may describe a steady progression: hunter-gatherers to farmers, villages to cities, simple tools to complex machines. But the closer you look, the more uneven it becomes. Some transitions are abrupt. Some are regional puzzles. Some appear as if someone tore a handful of pages from the story and left the binding intact. Agriculture is a good example. Farming isn't an obvious choice. It requires delayed gratification, deep ecological knowledge, enormous work for returns that are seasonal and uncertain. Early farmers often worked harder, ate less diverse diets, and suffered more disease than many foragers. So why adopt agriculture at all? And why, once it appears, does it spread so rapidly? There are explanations, yes. Climate stabilization after the last ice age, population pressure, local experimentation with wild plants. And yet, in several regions, domesticated crops appear in the record with a kind of abruptness, as though the long trial and error phase is missing or faint. Wild ancestors exist, but the intermediate steps sometimes feel sparse, like footprints washed away between one firm patch of sand and the next. This pattern repeats elsewhere. Stone architecture arrives with unexpected sophistication. Certain sites, ones we'll visit later, complicate old assumptions about the order of things. Writing systems emerge quickly, already able to carry complex meaning. Astronomical alignments show up at places that predate what we typically call advanced science. None of this demands a single lost global civilization. That idea can feel tidy, and the mind loves tidy. Loves. But the reality is likely messier, quieter, harder to reconstruct. A long, uneven stretch where knowledge accumulated, moved, fragmented, and sometimes vanished, without leaving the kinds of traces we're most used to trusting. And part of that difficulty is simple preservation. Most human activity does not fossilize well. Wood rots, fiber decays, earthworks erode, coastal settlements drown as sea levels rise. Entire ways of life can vanish with barely a whisper in the geological record. If a society didn't build in stone, if it didn't leave durable markers, its absence may tell us very little about its complexity. There's also the matter of perspective. Archaeology is shaped by what we expect to find. For a long time, researchers assumed monument building and complex planning required agriculture and permanent settlement. When evidence contradicted that, it was sometimes dismissed or misunderstood. Only more recently has there been wider willingness to question linear models of progress and consider that human societies may have explored multiple paths, some of which didn't lead directly to the civilizations we recognize today. Which brings us back again to the gap. Between deep time's mobile human groups and the recognizable dawn of civilization lies a stretch of history that feels underexplained. Not empty, never empty, but difficult to gather into a clean narrative. It's more like a mosaic with missing tiles, patterns hinted at, never fully revealed. Rather than forcing that mosaic into a single picture, we're going to move slowly. We'll look at what we know, what we suspect, and what remains unresolved. We'll explore why the gap exists, not as a flaw in human history, but as a reminder that much of the past operates beyond written memory. And as we continue, keep in mind, this isn't a story that marches toward a neat conclusion. It doesn't build toward a final answer waiting obediently at the end. It unfolds the way the past itself unfolds, unevenly, with moments of clarity followed by long stretches of uncertainty. The goal isn't to arrive somewhere definitive. It's to stay with the questions long enough that they stop feeling uncomfortable and start feeling familiar. Before writing was ever pressed into wet clay or brushed onto papyrus, long before dates could be pinned down and arranged like beads on a string, human life unfolded in a way that left very little behind for us to read directly. This is the stretch of time we call prehistory. Not because nothing happened, never because nothing happened, but because what happened was recorded in forms that don't translate neatly into our modern habits of proof. Prehistory is silent only in the sense that no one from that world can speak to us in sentences anymore. The ground speaks instead, quietly, through stone and bone, ash and soil, through the pattern of a hearth that was used again and again, through a scatter of flakes that tells you someone sat here and struck a chord for a long time, patient and practiced, through the way pollen settles into layers like a slow snowfall, keeping track of plants that rose and fell long after the people who walked among them have dissolved into the same earth. And the ground speaks only when we learn to listen in the way it requires, patiently, indirectly, accepting that we are translating. For most of our existence as a species, this was simply how life was lived. Modern humans did not appear holding tablets, measuring rods, and city plans. We arrived as bodies first, then as minds, and only much later, as record keepers. Anatomically modern Homo sapiens emerged at least 300,000 years ago. Not a metaphorical long time, but a span so immense it almost becomes abstract. It's long enough for entire climates to rearrange themselves. Long enough for coastlines to be drawn and redrawn. Long enough for human groups to spread, split, merge, and disappear again, leaving only faint physical punctuation marks behind. And within that span, what we call civilization, cities, writing, formal states, occupies a recent sliver. That fact alone should change the way we think, because it means that for the overwhelming majority of human time, the default human condition was not urban, not agricultural, not literate. It was mobile, it was local, it was intimate with land. That doesn't mean it was simple. It means it was shaped by different priorities. For hundreds of thousands of years, humans lived without permanent architecture and without agriculture. Yet there is no good reason to assume they lacked language, imagination, or emotional complexity. The brains were already modern. The capacity for abstraction, planning, and symbolic thought existed. We see signs of it, even in the fragments that survived. We see it in burials that include objects placed with the dead, tools, ornaments, pigments, suggesting beliefs about identity that extend beyond the moment. We see it in art. Animals painted on cave walls with careful attention to form, handprints pressed like signatures across time, geometric marks repeated in patterns that feel deliberate rather than random. We see it in the movement of materials, stone types carried far from their natural sources, shells transported inland, pigments moved across regions. None of this is the behavior of minds trapped in the immediate present. And yet, for long periods, the material record changes slowly. Tools shift gradually. Settlements remain temporary. Population stays relatively low. Technology is portable, designed to move. From a modern perspective, surrounded as many of us are by objects, by accumulation, by permanence, this slow material change can be mistaken for a slow mind. But the slowness may not be in intelligence, it may be in what survives. Stone is stubborn. Stone waits. Because stone survives, it becomes the loudest part of the prehistoric archive. But stone is not the whole toolkit. It is simply the part of the toolkit that does not rot. Early humans almost certainly relied heavily on wood, fibers, hide, plant materials, spears hardened in fire, cordage twisted from sinew and plant strands, baskets woven to carry berries and roots, clothing sewn with bone needles, shelters built from branches, reeds, and skins, traps and nets and snares, boats, containers, water skins. Most of this vanishes. A wooden spear disappears in a few seasons if it is left exposed. A woven basket turns to dust. A hide tent melts back into soil. Even the most skillful craftsmanship, if made from perishable materials, leaves no durable signature. So we build our image of prehistory from what remains. And what remains can be misleading. Stone tools, for example, dominate our understanding partly because they survive, and partly because they are recognizable. A chipped flake is obviously shaped. A hand axe is clearly intentional. We can hold it and feel the edge. We can replicate it. We can see the choices. But even here, we tend to see outcomes more than processes. We see the finished tool, not the thousands of gestures that taught the hand how to make it. We see the best examples, not the failures that shattered and were left behind in places we haven't excavated or in landscapes now erased. We see the durable residue of a much larger world. There's a tendency to underestimate prehistoric minds because they did not produce what we call civilization. That shortcut is tempting because it fits our biases. We equate progress with building. We equate intelligence with monuments and texts. But cognitive capacity does not depend on farming or architecture. A person who can plan a hunt, reading wind, predicting animal movement, coordinating roles, timing the chase, conserving energy, is operating within a complex mental framework. A person who can navigate a landscape without maps, remembering water sources, seasonal changes, and safe passages across hundreds of miles is carrying a kind of intelligence that rarely leaves behind a physical record. Even the act of making a stone tool requires foresight. Napping is not random. It is controlled fracture, guided by mental modeling. The maker must anticipate how force travels through material, strike at precise angles, and adjust in response to subtle changes in the stone. Success reflects practice. Practice implies teaching. Teaching implies social structure. People with enough stability and patience to transmit skills reliably. That transmission left no manuals. It lived in bodies and attention. And that is where the fragility of prehistoric knowledge becomes crucial. A society that does not write does not store long-term memory outside itself. It relies on continuity of people. A story told around a fire lasts as long as someone remembers it and chooses to repeat it. A method for making adhesive lasts as long as someone teaches it and someone else learns it. If the group is disrupted, knowledge can vanish quickly. In a world shaped by climate swings, disease, conflict, and migration, that fragility matters. It means whole libraries can disappear without flames because those libraries were living. The prehistoric world was far from stable. Over the past few 100,000 years, Earth's climate oscillated dramatically. Ice advanced and retreated. Sea levels rose and fell by more than 100 meters. Land bridges appeared and disappeared. Ecosystems shifted. Species moved or vanished. Human groups were forced to adapt again and again. During colder phases, resources became scarce. Groups might merge, compete, or fragment. During warmer phases, populations expanded, moving into new territories. Coastlines, places that today host dense populations, were often drowned during periods of rising seas. Entire coastal worlds likely lie underwater now, their evidence inaccessible and scattered. This alone may account for a significant portion of what feels missing. Another factor is time depth itself. When we say a tool tradition lasted 50,000 years, we create the impression of repetition, but that timescale is enormous. Within it, countless innovations may have appeared and vanished. Countless local traditions may have diverged and converged. The material record compresses variation. It smooths life into categories because our data is sparse. Prehistoric lives were not loops. They were crowded with births and deaths, alliances and conflicts, illness and recovery, discovery and loss. But much of that does not register at the scale we can observe. And there's also the matter of specialization. Civilization depends on division of labor. Farmers grow food, builders build, administrators record, priests maintain ritual frameworks. That division requires surplus and stability. Prehistoric societies often lacked consistent surplus, at least in the way agricultural societies generate it. That doesn't mean specialization did not exist. It likely did, but in fluid forms. A skilled toolmaker may also hunt. A healer may also gather. Roles shift with season and circumstance. This flexibility is strength. It is also a barrier to the kind of institutional accumulation that later civilizations achieve. Without permanent workshops, schools, and temples, knowledge remains personal and contextual. It can deepen, but it is harder to concentrate and scale. So when we later see civilization appear, as if it arrives with multiple systems at once, settlement, agriculture, monuments, writing, it can feel abrupt. But part of that feeling comes from how different the baseline was. Prehistory was not a waiting room. It was a complete mode of existence refined over immense spans of time. Humans were deeply attuned to their environments. They knew animal behavior, seasonal cycles, plant properties, water patterns, and landscape features with an intimacy that many modern people rarely need to develop. That knowledge was practical, embodied, local. It did not scale easily beyond the group. When we call prehistory a silence, we are naming our own difficulty in hearing it. We are used to history that speaks loudly through documents and monuments. Prehistoric humanity speaks softly through patterns that must be inferred. And because it speaks softly, we are tempted to assume less was said. But there is growing recognition that many foundations of civilization existed long before cities. Symbolic thought, exchange networks, ritual behavior, social complexity. These traits appear in prehistoric contexts again and again. What was missing was not intelligence, but the conditions that allow these traits to crystallize into permanent cumulative systems. Conditions are not guaranteed. They depend on climate stability, resource concentration, population density, and forms of social organization that reward long-term cooperation over mobility. When those factors align, change accelerates. When they don't, societies can remain stable for tens of thousands of years without turning into what we label progress. This is one way to understand the gap, not as a void, but as a stretch where knowledge exists without leaving durable markers, where mastery is real but invisible, where learning happens in ways that don't fossilize. And that brings us back to the material evidence we do have, and how it can be both revealing and deceptive. Because even within stone, the stubborn surviving voice of deep time, there are signs that challenge the idea of a slow, hesitant human awakening. When we look closely at prehistoric tools, they don't always look like first attempts. Sometimes they look like the end of a long tradition. And when you begin to notice that, the silence takes on a different quality. It stops feeling empty. It starts feeling crowded, filled with teachers we can't name, experiments we can't recover, and skills that lived for thousands of years in hands and minds that left behind only a few durable objects as proof they were ever here. In the next part, we'll listen more closely to those objects, the stone record, and how it reveals precision, planning, and even aesthetic intent far earlier than most people expect. Not to sensationalize it, but to let it complicate the simple story. Because the past rarely fits neatly inside the boxes we build for it. When we look closely at the material traces left behind by prehistoric humans, stone tools tend to dominate the conversation. Not because they were the most important objects in daily life, but because stone is the part that stayed behind to speak for everything else. Stone does not rot. It does not unravel. It does not dissolve easily into nothing. Stone waits, and because it waits, it becomes the primary voice that reaches us across deep time. But if you listen carefully to what that voice is actually saying, the story it tells is quieter than the usual narrative of gradual improvement, and in some ways, more unsettling. Because the stone record does not always show the slow, clumsy beginnings we expect. Sometimes it shows competence early, consistency early, techniques that feel less like discovery and more like inheritance. At first glance, a stone tool can look simple. A sharp edge, a pointed tip, a flake struck from a core. It's easy to imagine early humans experimenting like children, learning by accident, slowly refining their methods across endless generations. And yes, trial and error existed, practice existed, mistakes existed. But when archaeologists began to study stone tools with real seriousness, measuring angles, mapping fracture patterns, replicating methods experimentally, a different picture emerged. Many early tools show a level of control and repeatability that suggests long-standing tradition rather than first attempts. Consider the hand axe. These tools appear extremely early in the long human story and persist for immense spans of time across Africa, Europe, and parts of Asia. They're often symmetrical, balanced, carefully shaped, standardized in ways that imply shared expectations, an idea of what the tool should be before the first strike is ever made. Some are so well executed that modern researchers struggle to replicate them without extensive practice. That alone should slow us down. The maker had to understand not just how to break stone, but how to anticipate how it would break, how force would travel through it, how one strike would set up the next, how to see the finished shape while holding only a rough core. What makes this particularly strange is not just their quality, but their timing. Hand axes appear early, and then remain comparatively stable for what feels like an almost unreasonable length of time. In many technologies, refinement leads to rapid diversification. Here we see mastery without obvious acceleration, as if a high skill level was reached and then deliberately maintained rather than endlessly reinvented. That stability raises a quiet question. How long did it take to reach that level of skill before the first examples that survived? Stone preserves results better than it preserves learning curves. We see the successful tools. We rarely see the practice stages in any continuous legible way. The broken attempts may have happened in places that eroded, in camps now underwater, in zones never excavated, or long before the oldest tools we have, meaning that by the time stone becomes visible to us, the tradition was already mature. Then there is raw material selection. Prehistoric toolmakers did not simply pick up whatever rock was closest. They often sought specific stones with predictable fracture properties: flint, chert, obsidian. That choice implies geological understanding. It implies familiarity with where particular materials can be found. It implies planning, a decision made before the tool exists. And in many cases, those materials moved far from their sources. Some stone types appear hundreds of miles from the nearest natural outcrop, which suggests long-distance travel, repeated routes, or exchange networks between groups. We shouldn't romanticize this into a global market system, but we also shouldn't dismiss it as random wandering. To move a preferred stone across distance is to value it. To value it is to understand what it enables. To understand what it enables is to have a conceptual toolkit as well as a physical one. Obsidian is especially revealing. It produces edges sharper than steel, but it's brittle and unforgiving. Knapping obsidian requires controlled force and precision. Too much pressure, and it shatters. Too little, and nothing happens. Yet obsidian tools appear with clean edges, well-shaped forms, and repeated technique. In some regions, researchers can trace obsidian artifacts to specific volcanic sources, showing people returned to the same places or maintained long-distance connections to keep obtaining the material. Again, the object in your hand is only the visible end of a longer invisible process. You're holding not just a tool, but a network of knowledge: where to find stone, how to work it, how to transport it, and how to teach others to do the same. And the tool record gets more complicated when we remember that many stone tools were not purely stone. They were parts. Composite tools, stone points hafted onto wooden shafts using bindings and adhesives, are among the most revealing achievements of prehistoric engineering. Wood rarely survives. Fiber decays. But traces remain: microscopic residues, wear patterns, sometimes visible bits of adhesive preserved by chance. Making a composite tool requires multiple steps and multiple materials. You need a shaped point. You need a shaft. You need a binding, sinew, plant fiber, hide. You often need an adhesive, resin, bitumen, plant gum. Those adhesives may have to be processed, heated, mixed, and applied at the right moment, then cooled correctly to set. This is procedure, not accident, and procedure implies tradition, because a multi-step process fails if you don't know the sequence. The knowledge can be learned, yes, but it is rarely reinvented spontaneously in full. It is transmitted. When evidence for hafting appears tens of thousands of years before agriculture, it challenges our lazy categories. We tend to picture advanced technology, arriving with cities and metal. But sophisticated engineering existed in societies we often label simple. And then there is precision. Experimental archaeologists have shown that producing certain blade types requires an intuitive grasp of geometry and force. The nappa must strike the core at a particular point, at a particular angle, with a particular amount of energy, sometimes while holding it in a specific orientation that isn't comfortable or obvious. Mistakes ruin the piece. Success implies practice. Practice implies time. Time implies an environment where learning is supported, where a person can spend hours refining a skill instead of constantly scrambling for calories. And sometimes there are hints that these tools were not only functional, some are too symmetrical, too polished, too carefully finished beyond what function demands. Some hand axes appear unused or barely used. Their edges are sharp, but the wear isn't there. That has led researchers to suggest these objects may have carried social meaning, signals of skill, status, identity, perhaps even courtship or ritual display. If that's true, then the stone record isn't just about survival. It's about communication. Craftsmanship becomes language. I am competent. I belong. I can provide. I carry the tradition correctly. When you introduce social meaning, you introduce another level of complexity that rarely gets credited to the deep past. There are also cases where tools appear almost overbuilt for their practical task, hunting points that are delicate, thin, and regular, so refined they would have been fragile. That doesn't automatically mean they were ceremonial, but it does suggest that prehistoric humans were sometimes pursuing refinement, consistency, and perhaps even beauty. This matters because it undermines the idea that prehistoric technology was always crude and purely utilitarian. It suggests that people were capable of investing effort into form and symbolism long before writing or agriculture made those investments visible to us in other ways. So why, if these minds were already capable, if these hands were already precise, does the later emergence of civilization still feel like a sudden leap? One possibility is that the limitation wasn't cognitive. It was contextual. Stone tool mastery can exist within small mobile groups. You can teach knapping at a camp. You can transport blades. You can refine technique without building permanent infrastructure. But agriculture requires land stability. Writing requires administrative pressure. Monument building requires surplus and coordination. Urban life requires the management of density, waste, water, conflict, and distribution. In other words, the skills were there, but the conditions that reward certain kinds of complexity were not always aligned. Still, the stone record leaves us with an unsettling feeling, a sense of missing continuity. When you hold a prehistoric tool, you are holding an endpoint. Behind it lies a chain of practice and teaching you cannot see. The tool is like a single sentence torn from a book whose pages have disintegrated. You can admire the sentence, you can recognize its structure, but reconstructing the chapters that led to it is far more difficult. And that difficulty, the persistent sense that we are missing the middle of the story, sets the stage for what comes next. Because after a very long period of slow material change, the human record begins to accelerate. Villages become permanent, food becomes managed, stones become architecture, memory becomes externalized, and the acceleration is fast enough that it still catches us off guard. In the next part, we'll step into that sudden shift, the moment when the long road bends sharply, and we'll ask why civilization seems to appear already sophisticated, already functional, as if its apprenticeship happened behind a curtain. For a very long time, human history appears to move at a measured pace. Generations follow one another. Tools shift gradually. People adapt to landscapes and seasons with careful, patient intelligence. The world changes, yes, but the visible record of human life changes slowly, almost as if it's breathing. Then, within a comparatively short span of time, something happens that reshapes everything that follows. Villages become towns. Towns swell into cities. Fields replace wild mosaics of forest and grassland. Storage replaces immediacy. Writing appears. Hierarchies harden. Time itself begins to be counted, divided, recorded, managed. We often call this the dawn of civilization. But what makes it unsettling is not that it happened. It's the way it seems to happen. Compressed, clustered, sudden. Not like a slow sunrise that gradually brightens the horizon, but like someone turning on a lamp in a room you thought you understood. From a distance, the story can look reassuring. Humans learn to farm. Farming creates surplus. Surplus allows specialists. Specialists create complexity. Complexity becomes civilization. Neat. Logical. A clean chain that helps the mind feel stable. But when you look closely, when you stand near the evidence instead of reading a simplified timeline, the chain starts to loosen. In many places, civilization doesn't arrive gently. It arrives with systems already working, already depending on coordination and knowledge that feel as though they should have required a long period of visible trial and error. The strange thing is not the complexity itself. Humans are capable of it. The strange thing is the missing runway. If you were to examine how most complex systems develop, whether biological or technological, you'd expect early versions that are clumsy and inefficient. You'd expect false starts. You'd expect many competing approaches, gradual refinement, a visible learning curve. We often see exactly that in later periods. We can trace metalworking improvements, ship design changes, the evolution of printing, the progression of engineering. We can watch technology stumble and learn because those stumbles left behind durable traces. But in the transition from mobile foraging societies to full-scale civilizations, the apprenticeship often seems faint. Sometimes it feels like civilization steps into view, already wearing its full set of tools. Part of what makes this feel so sharp is timing. Anatomically, modern humans exist for hundreds of thousands of years without cities or writing. Then, in the last 12,000 years, give or take, complex societies arise in multiple regions: Mesopotamia, the Nile Valley, the Indus, northern China, Mesoamerica, the Andes. Different ecosystems, different plants, different animals, different cultural lineages, and yet the outcomes share structural similarities: permanent settlements, monumental construction, social stratification, formal religion, administrative systems. How can something so specific arise so widely in such a brief window? The question isn't whether humans could do it. They clearly could. The question is why it took so long to begin, and why, once begun, it accelerated so quickly. One major piece of the answer is climate. For much of prehistory, the planet's climate was volatile. Ice ages advanced and retreated. Rainfall patterns shifted, temperatures swung. In that instability, committing to permanent fields and buildings is risky. Mobility is safer. Mobility is resilience. But around the end of the last ice age, the climate entered a relatively stable period we call the Holocene. Seasons became more predictable. Temperature swings softened. Many regions grew richer in dependable plant and animal resources. That stability opened the door, but stability alone doesn't build cities. It allows them to persist once they exist. It doesn't explain the sudden clustering of multiple systems: agriculture, storage, monumental architecture, formal ritual, writing. And agriculture itself, the supposed engine of it all, is not as straightforward as the simple narrative suggests. Farming is often presented as a clear upgrade. People choose the reliability of crops over the uncertainty of foraging. Yet early farming often made individual lives harder. Skeletal evidence from early agricultural societies frequently shows more disease, worse dental health, nutritional stress, and heavy physical labor. Diets narrow. Dependence on a few staple crops increases vulnerability. A bad season becomes a crisis. So why adopt agriculture at all? And why does it spread so rapidly once it appears? Part of the answer may lie in scale. Agriculture is not necessarily a benefit at the level of the individual body. It's a benefit at the level of the system. It supports higher population density. It creates surplus that can be stored, redistributed, controlled. It enables specialization and hierarchy. In other words, farming can transform societies even if it doesn't immediately improve the daily experience of everyone in them. Once people settle, the logic of settlement begins to reshape everything. Storage becomes necessary, which brings containers and accounting. Property becomes a concept, which brings boundaries and enforcement. Larger populations create pressure for organization, rules, shared rituals, conflict resolution. Religion can become formalized, not because spirituality is new, but because shared ritual helps bind larger communities together and legitimizes emerging power structures. Writing emerges in this context, not as poetry, but as administration. The earliest writing systems we can identify tend to be lists and tallies, grain, labor, ownership. They appear functional almost immediately. There's little evidence of centuries of clumsy half-writing. When it arrives, it works. Architecture follows a similar pattern. Early monumental structures aren't crude experiments. They require planning, geometry, coordinated labor. Stone is quarried and moved. Structures are aligned with celestial events that require observation over long periods. These are not improvisations made in a moment. They are expressions of knowledge that feels already mature. What's especially striking is clustering. In many regions, it's not as though cities appear and then Thousands of years later, writing slowly emerges. And then, much later, monumental architecture. Instead, these features tend to appear within relatively close proximity of one another in time. Once the threshold is crossed, multiple systems lock into place and reinforce each other. Surplus supports specialists. Specialists create new tools and institutions. Institutions stabilize surplus. The feedback loop accelerates. The system begins to feed itself. That feedback loop helps explain why civilization surges once it begins. But it doesn't fully explain why the preparatory steps are so difficult to trace. Where are the half-formed versions? The awkward early trials of administration? The messy first efforts at large-scale cooperation? Some exist, faintly, but not with the clarity we might expect given the sophistication that follows. One possibility is that much of the preparation occurred in forms that don't preserve well. Social structure, oral tradition, ritual calendars, leadership frameworks, exchange relationships. These are the operating system of civilization, and they can evolve extensively without leaving stone or ink. By the time durable evidence appears, the social software may already be well developed. Another possibility is population density acting as a tipping point. As populations rise, ideas spread faster. Innovations accumulate, networks become denser. What looks sudden may be the visible expression of a long invisible buildup crossing critical mass. Still, even that doesn't fully account for how early civilizations show precision, standardized measurements, astronomical knowledge, complex symbolic systems, so early. And there is an additional uncomfortable possibility: our timelines may be incomplete. When the last ice age ended, sea levels rose dramatically. Vast coastal plains that were dry land for thousands of years were swallowed. Coastal zones are attractive. Abundant food, transportation routes, stable microclimates. If significant social and technological developments occurred in those drowned regions, much of the evidence may now lie underwater, scattered and difficult to access. In that case, inland sites might appear to show sudden innovation because the earlier stages occurred elsewhere, now erased by the sea. Underwater archaeology is still young, but it has already revealed submerged landscapes and tools that hint at far more complex coastal lifeways than we once assumed. Then, there is collapse. Human societies do not always move forward in smooth lines. They rise, fragment, reorganize, vanish. Knowledge can be lost as easily as gained, especially when it is not recorded externally. Early experiments in settlement or cultivation may have occurred, failed, and left little trace beyond scattered debris we have not recognized as part of a larger pattern. If that is true, then civilization's sudden appearance could be the successful iteration of multiple attempts, built on lessons learned and forgotten more than once. Not a single lost golden age, but a cycle of emergence and erasure that compresses our visible record. This does not require Atlantis. It only requires acknowledging how fragile complexity is, and how good deep time is at erasing it, unless it is repeatedly reinforced. What makes the sudden spark compelling is not that it demands a dramatic explanation, but that it exposes the limits of our certainty. We like smooth stories. We like timelines that reward patience with clarity. The rise of civilization refuses to fully cooperate. It appears rushed, crowded, almost impatient, as though multiple strands of development converged at once after waiting a very long time to converge. And perhaps that's exactly what happened. For thousands of generations, humans refined skills and social instincts suited to mobility, cooperation, observation, ritual, local ecological expertise. When the climate stabilized and populations grew, those latent capacities found new outlets. The shift wasn't from stupidity to brilliance. It was from one mode of organization to another. Still, the speed remains striking. Because once civilization takes hold, history gets loud. Text begins to speak. Monuments insist on being remembered. Names endure. We can follow rulers, wars, laws, floods of grain, inventories of cattle. The long prehistoric quiet gives way to a chorus, and yet that quiet never fully disappears. It lingers underneath, reminding us that the foundations of civilization were laid in a world that did not record itself, in lives that left little durable trace, in knowledge that lived inside people. Which brings us to a place that forces this realization into stone. A site that disrupted the comfortable sequence we used to teach. A ridge in what is now southeastern Turkey, where massive carved pillars rise from a time when, by the old story, no one should have been building anything like that at all. In the next part, we'll go there, slowly, and we'll let it complicate the order of things. For a long time, the story of early civilization rested on a comfortable sequence of assumptions. Humans learned to farm. Farming produced surplus. Surplus made permanent settlements possible. Settlements grew into towns. Towns grew into cities. And only then, only after the pantry was full and the workforce could be fed, did humans begin building temples, monuments, and large ceremonial structures. It was tidy. It made sense. It placed symbolic ambition at the end of the process, as a luxury you could afford only once survival had been secured by fields and livestock. And then quietly, a hill in southeastern Turkey began to undo that order. Göbekli Tepe sits on a limestone ridge overlooking what would have been, 12,000 years ago, a landscape of wild grasses and migrating game. When it was first identified, it did not arrive with fanfare. Its surface looked, at first glance, like many prehistoric sites: scattered stone tools, fragments, the usual hints of ancient activity. But when excavations began in the 1990s, the ground opened into something that did not fit the expected script. Massive stone pillars, carved and arranged in deliberate circular enclosures, rose from beneath the soil. Not small stones, not rough markers. Pillars as tall as a two-story building, some weighing many tons, shaped into a distinctive T-form. Their surfaces worked with confident relief carvings of animals and symbols. And the dates mattered. They mattered immediately. Göbekli Tepe was built around 9600 BCE, give or take, a time at the very beginning of the Holocene, just after the last ice age, thousands of years before the first cities we normally place at the start of civilization. According to the conventional model, the people of this era should have been small bands of hunter-gatherers, mobile, relatively egalitarian, lacking both the surplus and the organizational structures required for monumental construction. Yet, here it was. A place that demanded planning, coordination, skilled labor, sustained effort over long periods. The pillars themselves are impossible to ignore. T-shaped, cut from local limestone, carved with foxes, snakes, boars, birds, insects. Creatures rendered not as crude doodles, but as deliberate, repeated motifs. The carvings suggest a shared visual language, a set of meanings that persisted across generations of builders. The enclosures are arranged in circles, not perfectly mathematical circles, but clearly designed. Two larger central pillars often dominate the middle, with smaller pillars set around the perimeter, facing inward like a gathering. The geometry is intentional. And building it would have required quarrying stone, shaping it with stone tools, transporting immense blocks across uneven terrain, raising them upright, and stabilizing them in prepared sockets. This is not casual labor. It is not something a handful of people do in an afternoon because they had nothing better to do. Which raises the first and most obvious question. If these people were not settled farmers, how did they organize this? How did they coordinate enough labor to quarry and move multi-ton pillars? How did they feed workers during construction? How did they maintain continuity of design and symbolism over time? And perhaps the question beneath all the others, why do it at all? What would motivate mobile groups, people who, in our simplified imagination, should have been busy chasing food, to invest in a project that appears to serve no immediate survival function? One proposed answer is that Göbekli Tepe was not a village, but a ritual gathering place, a seasonal hub, a location where dispersed groups came together, drawn by ceremony, shared belief, social obligation, exchange, marriage alliances, or something we don't have a word for anymore, because the word was never written down. In this view, the site is not evidence of an early city. It is evidence of an early center, a place that gathered people before permanent settlement gathered them. If that is true, then religion, or ritual, or symbolic life did not emerge after agriculture. It may have helped drive people toward it, because gatherings require food, feasts require abundance. Large seasonal congregations create pressure for reliable resources, for storage, for managing wild landscapes more intensively. If you know that dozens, perhaps hundreds of people will come to a place at certain times, you begin to think differently about how you secure enough calories to host that convergence. In that framing, belief comes before bread, not because people suddenly became spiritual. Humans were almost certainly spiritual in some form long before, but because shared ceremony can be a tool of cohesion strong enough to reorganize economic life. This reverses the old model. Instead of surplus-enabling monuments, monuments could encourage the practices that lead to surplus. And yet, even this explanation, as plausible as it sounds, does not remove the unease. Seasonal gatherings still require leadership and planning. Someone had to decide where to quarry, how to design the enclosures, which symbols to carve, how to coordinate construction across time. Göbekli Tepe was not built once. It was used and modified, expanded and reworked over generations. That implies a cultural framework strong enough to persist, even if groups remained largely mobile. Oral traditions would have had to preserve not only stories, but architectural knowledge, symbolic systems, and social roles. People who knew how to do certain tasks, people whose authority was recognized in certain contexts. The carvings deepen the mystery. The animals depicted recur across different enclosures. They do not represent domesticated herds or cultivated fields. The world portrayed is still wild. Foxes and snakes, boars and birds, creatures that would have been powerful presences in daily life and in imagination. Some scholars have suggested these animals may represent clans, myths, spiritual forces, even constellations, though certainty remains out of reach. What is difficult to dispute is that the imagery is coherent. It repeats. It is part of a system. And then there are the pillars themselves. Those T-shapes, so distinctive, have led some researchers to interpret them as stylized human figures. In several cases, arms and hands are carved along the sides, as if the stone is wearing a body. If this reading is correct, then the enclosures may not be simple circles of stones. They may be gatherings of beings, ancestors, spirits, social representatives, something half human and half symbolic. Whether that interpretation holds in every detail is less important than what it suggests. Göbekli Tepe operates at a level of abstraction we did not expect this early. This is not mere decoration. It is meaning made durable. And then there is what may be the most haunting detail of all. At some point after centuries of use, the enclosures were deliberately buried. They were not simply abandoned to erosion. They were intentionally filled with earth, stone fragments, and debris sealed beneath the hill. This does not look like collapse after disaster. It looks like purposeful closure. A society buried its own monument. Why? Ritual conclusion is one possibility. Cultural transition is another. Environmental change, shifting belief, new senders replacing old ones. There are many hypotheses. None are fully satisfying on their own, but the act itself implies shared intent. Burial at this scale is not an accident. It is not done quietly by one person. It requires coordination, time, and agreement. Göbekli Tepe also forces us to rethink assumptions about hierarchy. Large construction projects are often associated with centralized authority, coercion, rigid class systems. But hunter-gatherer societies are frequently described as egalitarian. So how do we reconcile that? One possibility is that leadership existed in forms that don't resemble later kings or bureaucrats. Authority may have been situational, earned through ritual expertise, charisma, knowledge, or skill, rather than enforced through permanent control. Cooperation may have been motivated by shared belief rather than by taxation or threat. Another possibility is that we have underestimated the complexity of late prehistoric societies. Mobility does not preclude organization. Oral cultures can preserve astonishing detail. Social bonds formed through kinship, ritual, and shared identity can motivate collective action without formal institutions. Göbekli Tepe sits at the intersection of these possibilities. Too early to be agricultural civilization, too complex to be dismissed as simple foraging life. And that makes it a focal point, not because it proves a single hidden story, but because it breaks the comfort of the linear one. It suggests that the capacity for large-scale organization, long-term planning, and symbolic architecture existed before the material conditions we usually associate with them. It also suggests that much of what becomes civilization may have been cultural before it became technological. Shared meaning first, infrastructure second. And there is another uncomfortable thought hiding just behind that. Göbekli Tepe might not be unique. It may only be uniquely preserved. Similar sites could have existed elsewhere, built in materials that did not survive, or located in regions now underwater, or erased by later development. If so, then what we treat as an anomaly may be a rare window into a broader pattern, one we are only beginning to recognize. Göbekli Tepe does not hand us answers. It does not come with inscriptions explaining who built it or why. It gives us a challenge instead. A challenge to tidy timelines, a challenge to assumptions about what must come first, a challenge to the belief that complexity always arrives in one order and never in another. It reminds us that humans did not wait passively for the right conditions to become imaginative, ambitious, and organized. Those qualities were already present. They simply expressed themselves differently until the world became stable enough and dense enough for those expressions to harden into the forms we now call civilization. In the next part, we'll move from Göbekli Tepe's stone circles into the equally unsettling story of agriculture itself. Why it spread so fast, why it often makes life harder at first, and why its practice run is so difficult to see. When agriculture enters the human story, it doesn't arrive timidly. It doesn't creep in through a long, clearly documented sequence of tentative experiments that slowly, gently improve over tens of thousands of years. Instead, in multiple regions, it appears as a functioning system, capable of sustaining larger populations, already reshaping landscapes, already reorganizing daily life in ways that are difficult to reverse. After tens of thousands of years spent hunting, gathering, and moving with seasons, humans begin planting, harvesting, storing, and staying put. And they do so with a competence that suggests far more preparation than the evidence comfortably displays. For a long time, agriculture was framed as an obvious breakthrough. The story was simple. People discovered seeds could be planted, and farming provided a more reliable food supply than foraging. But when you slow down and look at the earliest agricultural communities with care, the simplicity dissolves. Early farming was not easier. It was often harder. Bones and teeth preserve the cost. Early agricultural populations frequently show signs of nutritional stress, dental decay, infectious disease, and repetitive physical strain. Diets narrowed. Dependence on a handful of crops increased vulnerability. Work became more relentless, clearing fields, planting, weeding, guarding, harvesting, processing, storing, repairing. From the perspective of an individual body, this shift is puzzling. Many foraging societies had diverse diets and flexible schedules, with periods of abundance and rest. Early farmers, in comparison, often labored more for less variety. So why adopt agriculture at all? And why, once it appears, does it spread so rapidly? Part of the answer is that agriculture is not simply a technology. It is a social transformation. It benefits systems even when it burdens individuals. Farming supports higher population density. It creates surplus that can be stored. Stored surplus can be controlled, taxed, redistributed, used to support specialists, used to build power. In other words, agriculture can generate the scaffolding for hierarchy. It can also create a demographic advantage. Farming communities can grow faster, simply because they can support more people per unit of land. Even if their lives are harder, their numbers can expand. Over time, numbers become pressure. Pressure becomes expansion. Expansion reshapes landscapes and absorbs or displaces neighboring lifeways. This process doesn't require conquest in the dramatic sense. It can happen quietly, through intermarriage, through the gradual encroachment of fields, through the slow narrowing of wild resource zones as agricultural land spreads. But there is another layer to the puzzle, and it's the one that keeps the missing runway feeling alive. Domesticated plants often appear in the archaeological record with traits that are clearly domestication traits, changes that do not occur instantly. Larger seeds, thinner husks, reduced natural seed dispersal, genetic shifts that imply sustained selective pressure across many generations. These are not small differences. They suggest long-term management, repeated harvesting, intentional replanting, and consistent selection. And yet the intermediate stages, the messy, long trial and error phase we would expect, can be faint. We know the wild ancestors. We know the domesticated forms. The path between them, in many regions, is partially visible at best. It's as though the story skips from gathering to farming with fewer transitional pages than logic demands. The Fertile Crescent is a classic example. Wheat and barley show domestication traits that imply long selection. You don't accidentally produce that kind of change in a handful of seasons. It requires repeated choices, year after year, about which plants to gather, which seeds to keep, which areas to return to, which stands to encourage. That kind of behavior is not casual. It is management. Yet the deep, visible footprint of that management phase can be hard to find. The same pattern appears elsewhere. Rice in East Asia develops along trajectories that imply careful understanding of wetlands, seasonal flooding, and plant cycles. Maize in Mesoamerica is perhaps the most dramatic of all. Its wild ancestor looks so different from modern corn that early researchers struggled to accept they were related. The transformation from that wild form to a staple crop is enormous. It implies long experimentation, selection, and cultural investment. And yet by the time maize becomes central, it is already integrated into society. Not an odd side project, but a foundation. In the Andes, potatoes and other crops show similar stories. Complex domestication pathways tailored to harsh environments and microclimates. These are not simplistic plant a seed and hope experiments. They require deep local knowledge, which brings us to something that matters and that sometimes gets overlooked. Hunter-gatherers were not ignorant of plants. They were not wandering through a green world without noticing what it could do. Foragers often possess extensive botanical knowledge. Edible species, medicinal species, toxic species, seasonal availability, processing methods to remove bitterness or poison, the relationship between rainfall and growth, the way certain plants follow certain disturbances. In many environments, foraging societies actively shape landscapes. They burn undergrowth to encourage particular plants. They harvest in ways that promote regrowth. They transplant useful species. They clear small areas. They create what might be called managed abundance. These practices blur the line between gathering and farming. They suggest a spectrum rather than a cliff edge. So perhaps agriculture did not emerge from ignorance, but from an intensification of something already happening. Not a sudden discovery, but a shift in commitment, from flexible management to fixed investment. And yet the speed of that shift, once it begins, remains striking. In some regions, the move from foraging to farming happens within a few centuries. Entire lifeways reorganize. Settlement patterns, tools, diet, social relationships. Fields appear. Storage grows. Ownership becomes meaningful. The rhythm of life locks into planting and harvest. Why does it accelerate so quickly? One reason may be inertia. Once a community invests in fields, irrigation, storage pits, walls, seasonal labor schedules, turning back becomes difficult. Farming creates obligations that stretch across years. It binds people to land and to one another. It also creates vulnerability. You cannot easily abandon a field the way you abandon a camp, because the field is your future calories. So agriculture is self-reinforcing. It becomes a system you live inside, not just a technique you use. Another reason may be social pressure created by gatherings and ceremony, feasts, rituals, and seasonal congregations, like the kind a site such as Göbekli Tepe suggests, require predictable food. If large numbers of people gather regularly, the incentive to secure surplus increases. Over time, small-scale cultivation done to support these events could expand. What begins as supplementary planting becomes central. In this view, agriculture is not purely an economic choice, it's a social one. It is a way of feeding a community that is learning how to gather itself. Animal domestication echoes this puzzle. Dogs appear early, likely woven into human life long before agriculture. Other animals, sheep, goats, cattle, emerged later, often alongside early farming communities. Domestication is not simply capturing an animal. It requires selective breeding, controlled mating, long-term management, protection, and an understanding of behavior that goes beyond hunting. Yet early domesticated animals appear already serving roles: meat, milk, hides, labor, transport. Their integration is rapid. It suggests intention, not accident. Here again, the knowledge likely predates the visible system. People who hunted herd animals for millennia would have observed their behavior closely. They would know migration routes, social structures, breeding seasons. Turning that knowledge into domestication is a shift in relationship, not a leap in perception. So what do we do with the missing preparatory phases? One possibility is preservation bias. Again, the practice run of agriculture could have occurred in contexts that leave little durable trace. Seasonal camps, temporary processing sites, landscapes gradually modified without permanent buildings, knowledge transmitted orally and embodied in practice rather than recorded. Another possibility is that experimentation occurred repeatedly, but was interrupted by instability. Before the Holocene, climate volatility may have made sustained farming too risky. A few seasons of cultivation could succeed, only to fail when conditions shifted. Communities might abandon the effort, return to foraging, and try again later. Each attempt would leave faint traces, easily erased. When stability finally arrived, one attempt persisted. And from our perspective, agriculture suddenly appears. This would mean the suddenness is partly an illusion created by survival. We see what stuck, not what was tried and lost. And that perspective does something important. It reframes agriculture not as a single invention, but as a tipping point where multiple strands converge. Ecological knowledge refined over generations, climate stability that allows investment to pay off, population pressure that rewards higher yields, social organization that can coordinate labor, ritual life that creates demand for surplus and gathering. When those strands lock together, farming becomes not just possible but compelling, even if it is physically costly. And once it takes hold, it reshapes everything. Landscapes become managed, time becomes scheduled, property becomes meaningful, inequality becomes easier to sustain. History accelerates, but beneath that acceleration is continuity, quiet continuity, with the prehistoric world. The hands that planted early fields were not naive hands. They belonged to people who had spent generations reading land and season, shaping ecosystems in subtle ways that do not always survive in our record. What appears sudden may be the moment we finally see something that had been building invisibly for a very long time. In the next part, we'll stay with that idea, how preservation filters what we know, by looking at the way bone, stone, and earth distort the past, and how entire libraries of knowledge can vanish without leaving a trace we would recognize. What we know about the distant human past is shaped less by what people once understood and more by what managed to survive. Bone, stone, and earth act like a narrow filter. They let certain kinds of evidence through while quietly erasing others. They preserve outcomes better than processes. They keep the hard parts and lose the soft ones. And because of that, prehistory can look simpler than it truly was. Not because prehistoric life lacked complexity, but because complexity so often lives in things that decay. Speech, gesture, custom, rhythm, teaching, song, fiber, wood, skin, smoke. Knowledge is fragile when it lives in bodies. When archaeologists reconstruct prehistoric life, they work from what is physically present: a stone blade, a fragment of bone, a smear of charcoal, a pattern of post holes. These remnants are not lies, but they are incomplete translations of much larger systems. A stone knife tells you something about napping, but almost nothing about how a child learned to make it. A cut-marked bone tells you an animal was butchered, but not how meat was divided, who ate first, or which taboos governed the act. A hearth tells you fire was used, but not which stories were spoken into that heat, or which songs anchored memory during a harsh winter. This imbalance doesn't just leave holes, it creates illusions. It can make the past seem technologically static, because stone survives while everything else disappears. It can make societies appear primitive, because the things we associate with complexity, writing, large buildings, were not the chosen storage methods for most of human time. If we want to understand the gap between prehistory and civilization, we have to sit with this uncomfortable fact. Our archive is biased, and the bias is not subtle. Bone is an instructive example. Bone tools appear tens of thousands of years before agriculture in many regions: awls, needles, points, fish hooks, ornaments. These objects imply activities stone alone cannot explain: sewing fitted clothing, weaving or binding materials, fishing with lines or nets, adornment that communicates identity and belonging. A bone needle is not useful unless you know how to use it. You need thread, sinew, plant fiber. You need a method for piercing hide without tearing. You need patterns. You need knowledge of how garments behave in movement and weather. That whole world of skill vanishes, leaving behind one slender object that can be misread as simple if you forget the invisible system behind it. Stone tools tell the same kind of story. As we've already seen, many show precision that implies teaching and tradition, but stone does not preserve the teaching. It preserves the result. The apprenticeship lived in demonstration, correction, repetition. In a society without writing, that apprenticeship is a social bond. It depends on trust, authority, time, and proximity. If a group fragments, if elders die, if migration breaks continuity, that skill can vanish quickly. And when it vanishes, it doesn't leave behind an obituary. It simply stops appearing. Earth holds evidence too, but it speaks in indirect ways. Soil layers preserve repeated activity. Compacted ground where people walked again and again, chemical traces from hearths, pollen, changes that reveal shifting plant communities. When researchers began reading these signals more carefully, a new picture emerged. Many foraging societies actively shaped their environments. They burned undergrowth to encourage certain plants and attract game. They harvested selectively to promote regrowth. They moved useful species beyond their natural ranges. They created mosaics of habitat that increased biodiversity. This is ecological engineering. It is long-term thinking, and it can exist without fields and fences, but its traces are subtle. A controlled burn looks like a natural fire unless you know how to read it. A managed landscape can look like wilderness unless you recognize that the wilderness may have been cultivated through generations of attention. This is where the idea of lost knowledge becomes less romantic and more realistic. Lost knowledge does not have to mean a hidden archive of impossible technology. It can mean countless small systems of understanding that never became fixed in durable form. Navigation without maps, medicine without written recipes, astronomy without instruments, governance without laws carved in stone. Take navigation. Humans crossed vast distances long before compasses. They moved across deserts, forests, ice sheets, and open water. They did so by reading stars, winds, currents, animal behavior, the shape of land, the smell of plants near water. Mental maps existed, maps carried in memory and shared through story and demonstration. But a mental map disappears when its carriers are gone. A route known for 1,000 years can vanish in one generation if the people who know it die, disperse, or stop traveling. Medicine is the same. Many societies develop extensive pharmacological knowledge from plants, minerals, animal products. Effective remedies are identified through long trial, observation, and careful transmission. Some of this knowledge survives where traditions remain unbroken. Much of it vanished when populations were displaced, diminished, or absorbed. Bone and stone do not tell us which leaves eased fever or which bark saved a child. Astronomy offers another quiet clue. Alignments in structures, repeated motifs in art, and seasonal ritual timing suggest long-term sky observation. Tracking solstices, equinoxes, lunar cycles, and the rise of certain stars requires patient attention across generations. You don't need writing to do it, but you do need continuity. If that continuity breaks, the sky knowledge can fragment. The names of stars can change. The timing of festivals drifts. The old observations become stories rather than schedules. When we later see precise alignments in stone, they can appear sudden. Because stone is the first durable place the knowledge becomes visible. The knowledge itself likely lived much earlier in oral calendars and embodied seasonal practice. Social knowledge may be the most invisible of all. How did people decide who led? How were disputes settled? How was violence prevented or contained? How were strangers treated? How were children taught and integrated? These systems govern daily life. They can be sophisticated, flexible, and effective, and they leave almost no trace. A society can be complex without building anything we would label civilization. Complexity can be distributed rather than centralized. It can be embedded in custom rather than institution. But our bias is toward what can be excavated: walls, tablets, monuments. So we risk mistaking absence of monuments for absence of thought. Lost knowledge also accumulates through environmental change. The end of the last ice age did not only raise sea levels, it erased entire coastal worlds. If people lived on continental shelves for thousands of years, and they almost certainly did, then the drowning of those landscapes is not a minor detail. It is an extinction of evidence. Settlements submerged. Gathering sites vanished. Trade routes erased. Sacred places lost. Even if people survived by moving inland, the knowledge tied to those places would be disrupted. Techniques suited to coastal abundance might no longer apply. Social networks might fracture. Ritual calendars tied to local cycles might lose relevance. In such a scenario, knowledge doesn't simply vanish. It mutates. Some parts survive, others fade. Some become myth. Some become taboo. Some are forgotten because they no longer help. This fragmentation can make later developments look like invention when they are actually reconfiguration. Agriculture may draw on ancient landscape management but intensify it under new pressures. Monument building may crystallize older ritual practice into stone. Writing may externalize record-keeping that existed through tokens, knots, memory, and oral tally. We see the durable version and mistake it for the beginning. There is another layer too: secrecy and restriction. Not all knowledge is meant to be shared widely. Many societies restrict certain practices to specialists, elders, initiates. A ritual calendar might be held by a small group. A healing method might be taught only under certain conditions. A navigational tradition might be guarded. If the social structure that protects specialized knowledge collapses, that knowledge can disappear entirely, even if people survive. This can produce the sensation of sudden appearance later. A skill resurfaces when a lineage reestablishes it, and it looks like a new invention because the chain of transmission is hidden or broken. And sometimes, the earth hides evidence by human choice. Later societies build over earlier ones. Fields erase camps, cities bury villages, sacred sites are sealed. Göbekli Tepe itself was deliberately buried, as if someone wanted that chapter closed. In such cases, loss is not only decay, it is decision. A cultural transition can involve active forgetting. When belief changes, older practices may be suppressed, abandoned, or symbolically buried. From our perspective, this looks like a gap. From theirs, it may have been a deliberate break. All of this, preservation bias, Environmental erasure, fragile transmission, selective secrecy, and intentional burial complicates the gap between prehistory and civilization. The absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. It is evidence of selectivity. Bone, stone, and earth preserve outcomes. They do not preserve the full architecture of learning. They show us what was done, not how it was debated, taught, corrected, or remembered. This means that when we encounter early civilizations that seem to arrive without preparation, we may be seeing the first moment when accumulated knowledge becomes visible in durable form. Writing externalizes memory. Architecture externalizes planning. Agriculture externalizes ecological management. Before these systems harden, much of the same capacity exists, but it lives internally, socially, orally. Lost knowledge, then, is not a single missing library we might one day uncover. It is a condition of deep history. It is the default state of human experience before external memory systems dominate. And if that is true, then the suddenness of civilization becomes less like a miracle and more like a visibility event. The moment when the quiet work of countless generations finally leaves marks sturdy enough to survive. In the next part, we'll stay with that idea and follow it into the realm of monuments, structures older than memory should allow, and what they tell us about how humans began anchoring time and meaning in stone long before writing could do it. Long before written language fixed dates in place, long before calendars divided a year into tidy boxes and rulers insisted their names be remembered, humans were already building things meant to outlast the season. Not shelters that could be folded and carried, not camps that could be abandoned without grief, but structures that demanded effort far beyond immediate survival. Monuments. And what makes early monuments unsettling is not only their age, but their confidence. As if the builders already understood permanence in a world where so little was meant to last. When we think of monuments, our minds often jump to familiar icons. Stonehenge, the pyramids, temples rising above cities. These feel ancient, but they sit comfortably close to recorded history or just beyond it. The story becomes stranger when monuments begin to appear in periods where, according to older models, they should not exist at all. Göbekli Tepe was one rupture in the sequence, but it is not alone in what it suggests. Across the globe, structures appear that predate writing and sometimes predate clear evidence of agriculture, yet require planning, coordination, and symbolic intent. They belong to cultures that left no written explanation of what they were doing or why, and that absence matters because monuments are not just engineering. They are meaning made heavy. Consider megalithic construction more broadly. Large stones moved, shaped, and arranged. Dolmens, cairns, stone circles, alignments, platforms, standing stones. These forms appear across Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Americas. Many are associated with later agricultural societies, yes, but some emerge early enough to complicate the assumption that large building requires settled life and surplus. Moving a multi-ton stone is not trivial. Without modern machinery, it demands coordination, shared labor, and motivation strong enough to overcome immense physical cost. Doing it repeatedly implies organization, and that organization challenges the simplistic image of prehistoric life as loosely connected bands drifting without long-term collective purpose. What is especially striking is the precision. Many monuments are placed deliberately in relation to landscape features, celestial events, or cardinal directions. This isn't always obvious until you measure, map, and compare. But once you begin to look, patterns appear. Alignments with solstices and equinoxes, sight lines to particular horizon points, placements that turn a landscape into an instrument. These choices are not casual. They suggest sustained attention to time and space. They suggest continuity, because you cannot confirm a solstice alignment in a single afternoon. You have to watch. You have to return. You have to track extremes across years. Lunar cycles demand even more patience. So when early monuments encode celestial patterns, it raises an immediate question. Who held that knowledge before the stone was placed? Observation must precede construction. Tradition must precede monument. The monument is not the beginning of knowledge. It is the crystallization of knowledge into durable form. In many cases, early monuments appear in landscapes with little evidence of permanent settlement nearby. This implies they were not primarily residential architecture. They were gathering places. People may have traveled seasonally, ritually, socially to participate in ceremonies, exchange, marriage alliances, communal labor. Such gatherings require coordination across groups that may not live together year-round. They also require shared beliefs strong enough to motivate participation. And belief is often treated as an afterthought in discussions of early societies, as if it were decoration applied after economic needs were met. Monuments suggest the opposite. Building something that does not directly feed or shelter you implies faith and meaning beyond immediate survival, meaning strong enough to justify effort. Whether that meaning was spiritual, ancestral, cosmological, or social, it mattered enough to mobilize bodies. The choice of material matters too. Stone is not the easiest medium. Wood is easier to shape. Earth is easier to move. Fiber and skin are easier still. Yet again and again, humans choose stone when they want to create something that endures. Stone lasts. Stone remembers. Stone continues speaking when voices are gone, but stone also hides as much as it reveals. We can measure the blocks. We can analyze tool marks. We can reconstruct engineering possibilities. What we cannot easily reconstruct is the lived meaning, the debates, the rituals performed during construction, the emotional logic that made people return again and again. A finished monument is the end of a process whose middle is mostly lost. And then there is a paradox. Sometimes monuments are deliberately buried, sealed, dismantled. Göbekli Tepe is the clearest example, but not the only one. In many cultures, structures are intentionally covered or closed. That suggests monuments were not static, forever objects, but participants in living traditions. Traditions can conclude, beliefs can change. A monument can be retired, like a ritual garment folded away. Why build something monumental if you plan to hide it? One answer is closure, ritual completion, an act of sealing power, ending a chapter. Another is transition, an old center losing relevance as people move, new practices replacing old ones. Another is protection, keeping a sacred place from misuse. Whatever the reason, deliberate burial implies shared intent and organized action. It also reinforces something important. Early monument builders were not merely stacking stones. They were working within symbolic systems sophisticated enough to include beginnings and endings, openings and closings. This brings us back to energy. How could non-agricultural societies afford monument building? Hunter-gatherers are often portrayed as living on the edge of subsistence, too busy surviving to build anything large. But this picture is incomplete. Many foraging societies are highly efficient, with periods of abundance when work is light and food is rich. Seasonal surges, fish runs, migrations, ripening wild grains can support large gatherings. If a community gathers when resources peak, you can concentrate labor temporarily without permanent settlement. In that context, monument building becomes feasible without farming, if social cohesion is strong and motivation is powerful. But scale still matters. Some monuments require effort repeated over years. That implies long-term commitment. It implies that people returned, not once, but again and again. Such commitment requires trust in continuity, the belief that effort invested now will matter later, perhaps even after you are gone. This is generational thinking. And generational thinking is one of the hidden foundations of civilization. Monuments externalize memory before writing does. They anchor identity in time and place. They create fixed points in a world of movement. A stone circle can be a calendar, a ritual theater, a meeting ground, a symbol of belonging. A mound can be a lineage marker. A standing stone can be a boundary, a witness, a story made solid. In this sense, monuments are not primitive precursors to later architecture. They are sophisticated tools. They coordinate social life. They synchronize dispersed groups. They align human activity with seasonal and celestial cycles. They make time visible. When you see early monuments across wide regions, another question emerges. Why similar impulses appear in distant cultures with no clear context? Stone circles in Europe, mound complexes in the Americas, megalithic tombs in parts of Asia, alignments and platforms in Africa and the Pacific. Each tradition has its own language, its own meaning, but the underlying impulse repeats. This suggests that monument building may be a recurring human solution to recurring human challenges. How do you remember across generations? How do you gather dispersed people? How do you align life with cycles that outlast individual memory? How do you make meaning durable? Stone is one answer, and the timing, the way monuments appear suddenly in the record, may be another preservation illusion. Earlier monuments may have existed in wood, earth, fiber, materials that vanish. Wooden posts can encode alignments, but they rot. Earthworks erode, woven markers dissolve. If such structures were common, then stone monuments may be the first visible iteration of a much older practice. Not first drafts, final drafts. The moment a tradition becomes solid enough, socially and symbolically, to justify the labor of permanence. This idea harmonizes with the pattern we've been tracing. Writing appears sudden because it externalizes memory that was already managed orally. Agriculture appears sudden because ecological management already existed in flexible form. Monuments appear sudden because symbolic systems already matured in perishable expressions. What feels like a leap may be the moment the invisible becomes visible. There is also selection in what survives. Stone monuments survive better than wooden ones. Large structures survive better than small ones. Sites reused or buried survive better than those eroded or built over. This survival bias shapes our view. We may be mistaking rarity for novelty. The monuments we see could represent a small fraction of what once existed, with others submerged, eroded, or hidden beneath later construction. Every new discovery expands the map, suggesting that what we have is not the whole story, but a scattered sample. Monuments older than memory should allow challenge not only timelines, but confidence. They remind us that humans cared about time, place, and continuity long before history kept formal score. They show that long-term planning and collective action did not wait for agriculture or writing to appear. They also force us to confront something humbling. Much of the meaning behind these structures is gone. We can measure stones, we can map alignments, we can analyze construction, but we cannot fully recover the stories that animated these places. And yet the monuments still speak. They tell us that knowledge can exist without being written, that memory can be anchored in landscape, that societies we once dismissed as simple were capable of thinking far beyond the immediate present. Between the first stone tools and the first cities lies a long stretch where humans were already experimenting with permanence, finding ways to make time and meaning hold still long enough to be shared. In the next part, we'll move into the missing millennia more directly. The span between Ice Age instability and fully visible civilization, why it feels underexplained, and how drowned coastlines, social invisibility, and repeated resets might be shaping what we think we know. Between the deep, sprawling stretch of prehistory and the recognizable rise of civilization lies a span of time that refuses to sit comfortably in our explanations. It isn't empty, it isn't brief, and yet it is often treated as if it can be crossed in a few quick steps, like a shallow creek you hop over without looking down. This is the missing millennia, a long interval where something clearly happened, but where our ability to describe it with confidence thins out, like mist lifting off a field and revealing only partial outlines. When people talk about a gap, it's tempting to picture a void, as if humanity paused, waiting for the next act. But this period was crowded with lives. People were hunting, gathering, making tools, raising children, telling stories, forming alliances, fighting, migrating, experimenting. The gap isn't in human experience, it's in our evidence. More precisely, it's in the kind of evidence we tend to trust most: written records, durable buildings, clear sequences of development. The missing millennia are missing because they were lived in ways that didn't reliably fossilize. Their boundaries blur depending on region. In some places, settled life begins earlier. In others, much later. There was no global switch that turned civilization on everywhere at once. There were many local trajectories unfolding under broadly similar pressures. One of the most significant pressures was environmental. The planet was emerging from the last major ice age, and that emergence was not gentle. Glaciers retreated, meltwater surged, rivers changed courses, storm patterns shifted, ecosystems reorganized, sea levels rose dramatically, swallowing continental shelves that had been dry land for thousands of years. For people living through this, it wouldn't have felt like slow change. It would have felt like loss. Imagine a coastline you've known your entire life creeping inward year by year. Campsites flooded, shellfish beds drowned, familiar fishing spots gone, sacred places taken by the sea, trails erased. Now widen that across generations. Sea level rise at the end of the Ice Age didn't simply redraw maps. It erased landscapes that may have hosted dense, stable human populations. Coastal communities living with abundant food, travel routes, exchange networks, and perhaps forms of complexity that never had a chance to externalize into stone and writing before the ocean covered them. This is not speculation in the abstract. We know sea levels rose by more than 100 meters. We know humans favored coasts. We know much of the continental shelf is archaeologically underexplored because it is difficult and expensive to study underwater. If important developments occurred in drowned regions, their loss would create the illusion of sudden appearance inland. A practice could spread from a submerged homeland into new territories, and when it shows up on land, it looks like a spontaneous invention. So the first reason the millennia feel missing is simple. A large part of the stage is underwater. But even if we imagine every coastal site perfectly preserved and perfectly accessible, we would still face another problem. Much of what changes during this interval is not material. It is social. The shift from small mobile groups to larger, more settled communities isn't just a matter of building houses. It requires new ways of negotiating proximity, new methods for resolving conflict, enforcing norms, coordinating labor, and maintaining trust beyond close kinship. These mechanisms can evolve extensively without leaving a clear archaeological signature. A ritual can synchronize people across distances for centuries without building anything we would call a temple. A system of obligations can maintain order without written law. Leadership can exist without crowns. Specialization can exist without permanent workshops. These are real forms of complexity, but they rarely fossilize. So the second reason the millennia feel missing is that we are trying to excavate something that often doesn't leave artifacts: the growth of social software. During this time, humans likely shifted from short-term strategies optimized for instability to longer-term strategies that assume continuity. This is subtle, but profound. It changes how you plan. If the world is unstable, you prioritize flexibility. You move with resources, you avoid heavy investment, you keep your options open. If the world becomes stable, investment makes sense, you can return to the same place. You can plant, you can build, you can store. You can assume the future will resemble the past, enough for a plan to matter. The Holocene offered more predictability, and predictability is like fertile soil for cumulative systems. But predictability alone doesn't create civilization. It merely allows experiments to persist long enough to become traditions. And that leads to a third reason the millennia feel missing. The transition may have been gradual in lived experience, but abrupt in the archaeological record. Many groups likely maintained seasonal rounds even as they became more tethered to certain places. They might return to the same valley every year, to the same riverside, to the same ridge, building familiarity and meaning without permanent stone architecture. A place used seasonally for centuries can become a cultural anchor without ever producing a city. Then one day, perhaps after a population increase or a shift in resource availability, that anchor becomes permanent. From the inside, this is a small adjustment. We'll stay longer. We'll build a bit more. We'll plant more here. From the outside, thousands of years later, it looks like a leap. Suddenly, a settlement. The record makes it look sudden because the earlier phases were light on durable construction. Population dynamics add another layer. Small increases in population density can have outsized effects. More people means more interactions, more pressure on resources, more exchange of ideas, more incentive to organize. At certain thresholds, complexity can accelerate because the network itself becomes denser. Innovation spread faster. Specialization becomes more likely. Standardization becomes necessary. Informal agreements become formal customs. This can create tipping points. Below a threshold, systems remain loose and reversible. Above it, they become self-reinforcing. If population density crossed such thresholds during the missing millennia, the suddenness of civilization could be the visible expression of that tipping point. There is also another possibility, one that doesn't require a single dramatic catastrophe, but does require us to accept that human progress is not a smooth upward line. Multiple attempts. Human societies may have experimented with settlement, cultivation, and complex organization several times, only to abandon them, lose them, or see them collapse under stress. Without writing, failures leave faint traces. A settlement that lasts a few generations may not leave clear layers that scream prototype city. A cultivation experiment that is abandoned may look like ordinary plant gathering. A social system that collapses may leave nothing but scattered tools and a change in site usage patterns. If early attempts happened and failed repeatedly, then the visible rise of civilization could be the successful iteration, the one that finally persisted long enough to leave durable evidence. From our perspective, it looks like a single leap. In reality, it could be the end of a long series of starts and stops. This idea doesn't require a lost empire. It requires only acknowledging fragility. We know, from later history, that complex societies can unravel quickly. Infrastructure decays, knowledge becomes uneven, skills disappear. If that can happen in literate societies with stone buildings and written archives, it can happen even more easily in societies where memory lives primarily in people. So the missing millennia might be missing partly because deep time is not kind to fragile complexity. And finally, there is the problem of our own categories. Archaeology has often treated certain markers, farming, cities, writing, monuments, as the definition of complexity. But complexity can take many forms. A society can be ecologically sophisticated and socially intricate without building cities. It can manage landscapes intensively without domestication. It can maintain ritual calendars and long-distance exchange without writing. If such societies dominated portions of the missing millennia, our expectations would lead us to overlook them. We would see continuity in stone tools and assume continuity in everything else, missing deeper shifts in behavior and organization. In other words, the gap may be partly conceptual. We draw a line at writing and call everything before it prehistory, as if it were all one uniform haze. But people living through the transition likely experienced continuity rather than rupture. They didn't wake up one morning and decide, today we invent civilization. They adapted, they adjusted, they responded to pressures and opportunities. The rupture appears in hindsight because we compress time into diagrams. And still, despite these explanations, the discomfort remains. There are real discontinuities, real absences, practices that appear without obvious ancestors. The missing millennia persist not as one clean mystery, but as an accumulation of small unknowns that refuse to align perfectly. Perhaps the most honest conclusion is this: the gap is not a single lost chapter waiting to be recovered whole. It is the expected result of trying to reconstruct the lives of people who did not store their complexity in materials built to endure. We are listening for voices that spoke softly and briefly, while stone and soil amplify only certain tones. And yet, even within that incomplete record, there are hints, patterns that suggest disruption as well as development. Which leads to the next question, the one people often reach for when the gap feels too wide. Were we reset? Did catastrophe, climate shock, flooding, fire, collapse break continuity again and again, making the rise of civilization look sudden because it followed loss? In the next part, we'll step carefully into that territory. Not to chase drama, but to acknowledge that Earth has always been capable of erasing human worlds, and that forgetting can happen quietly even without a single dramatic end. When people encounter gaps in history, especially gaps as wide and stubborn as the one between deep prehistory and full civilization, the mind reaches for something dramatic. Sudden change invites sudden causes. If complex knowledge appears abruptly, perhaps something erased what came before. If societies seem to restart, perhaps they were reset. This is where catastrophe enters the conversation, not as fantasy, but as a serious line of inquiry rooted in a simple fact. Human systems are fragile. The question is not whether catastrophes happened. They did. The question is whether disruption was large enough, frequent enough, or repeated enough to fracture continuity again and again, so that what we call the unexplained gap is less about invention from nothing and more about rebuilding with partial memory after loss. Earth's recent past was anything but calm. The end of the last ice age was not a smooth warming like a thermostat gently turned up. It was a period of rapid climatic shifts, violent environmental reorganization, and sudden events that would have felt, to human communities, like the world changing shape under their feet. Temperatures rose, but not in a steady line. They jumped, dipped, and jumped again. Ice sheets melted unevenly. Meltwater surged into valleys. Massive floods carved channels. Rivers changed course. Rainfall patterns shifted. Storms intensified. Coastlines moved. Sea levels rose by more than 100 meters over several thousand years. That sounds gradual when spoken in scientific calm. It would not have felt gradual if your home was on the edge of the sea. For coastal and riverine societies, change would have been relentless. Camps flooded. Resource zones drowned. Salt water pushed into estuaries. Freshwater systems reorganized. Familiar travel routes vanished. Sacred places became unrecognizable or inaccessible. And that kind of disruption doesn't need to kill everyone to erase knowledge. It only needs to break transmission. In societies without writing, memory lives in people. If elders die, if groups scatter, if migration routes dissolve, if the social context that gives knowledge meaning disappears, then knowledge can vanish quickly. A technique can be lost not because it is impossible, but because it is no longer useful in the new landscape. A story can be forgotten not because it is untrue, but because the world it refers to is gone. One of the most compelling and often underestimated forms of catastrophe is sea level rise itself. During glacial maxima, sea levels were far lower than today. Continental shelves were exposed, wide coastal plains rich in resources, ideal for settlement. These areas were not marginal, they were attractive. Abundant food, stable climates, travel corridors, meeting grounds. If human populations clustered along these now drowned shelves, then the rising sea would have done something enormous. It would have erased evidence, not metaphorically, physically. Any early settlements, ritual sites, long-used gathering places, exchange hubs, submerged, scattered, difficult to reach, often destroyed by waves and currents over time. If key developments occurred in these drowned regions, experiments in cultivation, complex ritual centers, early forms of regional organization, then their loss would create the illusion of sudden appearance inland later. A practice could migrate with survivors, and when it shows up in a new place, it looks like it arrived out of nowhere. Climate instability also reshapes food systems. Shifts in rainfall can collapse familiar foraging strategies. Animal migrations can change routes. Plant ranges can move. In unstable conditions, societies may be forced into rapid experimentation, not because the new method is ideal, but because the old method fails. This context makes agriculture look less like a chosen upgrade and more like a stress response, a way of buffering against unpredictability by intensifying control over a few key resources. And there is a specific climatic shock during this transition that has become central to the discussion: the Younger Dryas. Roughly 12,900 years ago, after a period of warming, the climate in many regions abruptly snapped back toward colder, drier conditions. This state lasted over a millennium. Imagine what that means for communities already adjusting to warmer landscapes. Just as ecosystems begin to stabilize, the world shifts again. Plant distributions change, water becomes less predictable, game patterns alter. Any fragile experiments in cultivation or semi-sedentary life would face severe pressure. Systems under development can collapse under that kind of stress. And without writing, the collapse leaves few clear signatures. The evidence can look like ordinary abandonment, ordinary migration, ordinary shifting camp patterns. Then, the Younger Dryas ends abruptly. Temperatures rise quickly into the Holocene, and the climate becomes more predictably stable. From our perspective, it can look as if civilization appears suddenly after that point. From theirs, it may have felt like rebuilding. This is where catastrophe becomes relevant. Not as a single apocalyptic event that wipes the slate clean, but as repeated shocks that fray the threads of continuity. Beyond climate, there are sudden destructive events that can devastate regions. Volcanic eruptions that darken skies and poison water, earthquakes that reshape valleys, floods that sweep away settlements, droughts that drive migration, disease that shatters social structure. Even events that are regional can be world-changing for the people inside them. And when disruption is repeated over generations, it can create cultural memory shaped around loss. This is where myth enters. But we'll return to myth more explicitly in a moment, because it matters here, not as proof, but as signal. Still, catastrophe is only one side of the story. The other side is quieter and in some ways more powerful. Forgetting. Even without dramatic disaster, knowledge can fade when it's no longer reinforced. Skills tied to specific environments lose relevance when people move. Social structures dissolve when population density changes. Rituals lose meaning when belief systems shift. What is not used is not preserved. And because prehistoric knowledge was embodied, forgetting could be swift. It is possible for a community to survive physically while losing large portions of its inherited knowledge within a few generations. Not because people become less intelligent, but because the conditions that made the knowledge useful have changed. A navigation tradition becomes irrelevant if you stop traveling. A hunting technology becomes irrelevant if the prey disappears. A seasonal ritual becomes irrelevant if the climate no longer behaves as it did. A medicinal practice becomes irrelevant if the plants are no longer available. And sometimes forgetting isn't passive. It is deliberate. When humans adopt new ways of living, they often abandon older ones with intention. Settling permanently requires changing values. Flexibility gives way to predictability. Shared access gives way to ownership. Movement gives way to boundaries. Older knowledge suited to mobility, may be devalued, suppressed, treated as backward, forgotten because the new system rewards different skills. In agricultural societies, deep knowledge of wide-ranging ecosystems may become less central. Familiarity with migratory routes may fade. Oral traditions tied to movement may fragment when communities settle. In this sense, a reset does not require an external catastrophe. It can be cultural. A society can reset itself by reorganizing its priorities, by building new institutions that make old skills less relevant, by choosing permanence over flexibility. And writing accelerates this effect. Once information is stored externally, memory practices change. What is written gains authority. What is not written becomes easier to dismiss. Oral traditions shift. The divide between before and after hardens. Everything prior becomes prehistory, even if people felt continuity. This can make earlier knowledge seem absent rather than undocumented. So when we ask whether humanity was reset, the most realistic answer may be, in many places, yes. Partially, repeatedly, and unevenly. Not a single global restart, but a pattern of disruption and recovery, loss and reconstruction, skills preserved in some lineages and forgotten in others, practices abandoned and later rediscovered, knowledge migrating, fragmenting, recombining. We can see how plausible this is by looking at later history. The collapse of the Western Roman Empire led to loss of infrastructure, literacy, and technical capacity in parts of Europe. Complex systems unraveled quickly. Skills persisted unevenly. Centuries later, people rediscovered techniques that had once been common. If such loss can occur in a literate world with stone cities and written archives, it is far easier to imagine in a world where memory lived in people and perishable tools. This doesn't mean everything was lost. Humanity rarely returns to zero. But it does mean continuity can be broken in ways that leave little visible trace. And it suggests that the sudden appearance of civilization may be, at least in part, the appearance of stability. The first moment when systems externalize themselves enough, through agriculture, writing, durable architecture, to resist the eraser of time. Catastrophe and forgetting reinforce each other. Disruption accelerates forgetting. Forgetting reduces resilience to future disruption. Over long periods, this cycle can repeat many times. What remains visible to us are the moments when the cycle stabilizes long enough for complexity to harden into durable forms. And this is where the past begins to speak in a different kind of language. Not stone and bone, but story. Because when people rebuild after loss, they rarely say, "We are reinventing everything." They say, "We are restoring." They say, "We were taught." They say, "There was a world before." Those phrases appear again and again across human cultures. In the next part, we'll listen to those echoes. Myths that remember floods, teachers, lost ages, not as literal history, but as memory under pressure, carrying signals across the gap where other evidence fails. When written records fall silent and material traces thin out, one form of evidence remains stubbornly present across cultures and continents. Stories, myths, narratives pass from one generation to the next, reshaped by language and belief, but anchored to something that mattered enough to remember. For a long time, modern scholarship treated these stories as ornaments, interesting, symbolic, and unreliable. But as archaeology, climatology, and anthropology have matured, myths have begun to look different, not as literal chronicles, not as newspapers from the past, but as memory under pressure, compressed, moralized, ritualized, adapted to survive without writing. And that makes them valuable when we're trying to understand periods where other forms of memory failed. Across the world, similar themes recur with unsettling persistence. Floods that erase an earlier world, teachers who arrive after catastrophe to restore knowledge, a prior age that was closer to cosmic order, more complete, more harmonious, survivors who rebuild using fragments of what was lost. These patterns are too widespread to dismiss as coincidence, yet too diverse to point cleanly to a single global event. What they suggest instead is something quieter and more plausible: repeated disruption, repeated loss, repeated rebuilding. Flood myths are the most obvious place to begin. They appear in Mesopotamia, where the Epic of Gilgamesh tells of Utnapishtim warned of a deluge that would wipe out humanity. They appear in the Hebrew tradition with Noah. In India, Manu is warned by a fish. In China, stories of great floods threaten society itself. Across the Americas, indigenous traditions describe waters covering land and reshaping the world. Similar motifs appear in island cultures across the Pacific, in Australia, in Africa. The details differ, the moral framing differs, the names differ, but the structure is familiar. There is a world before. There is a turning point, transgression, imbalance, or simply a shift in fate. Water comes. The old world is erased. A few survive. From them, a new world begins. It is tempting to search for one catastrophic flood to explain them all. That approach rarely holds up. The Earth is complex. Floods are local, regional, repeated, shaped by geography. But the end of the last ice age did involve dramatic sea level rise, river reorganization, and meltwater surges, flooding on scales that would feel world-ending to communities living inside them. If coastal plains were drowned over generations, if rivers repeatedly broke their banks and changed course, If whole settlement zones vanished beneath water, then flood memory would not be an odd mythic flourish. It would be a cultural anchor, not a precise timeline, but an emotional and practical truth. The world can change suddenly. Stability is fragile. What came before can vanish. And there's often another element in these stories. Survival depends on foresight, warning, or favor. Someone listens, someone prepares, someone carries something forward. That something is often framed as knowledge, seeds, tools, names, sacred objects, rules, which leads to another recurring figure, the teacher. In many traditions, after catastrophe or at the beginning of a new age, knowledge is restored by beings who already possess it. Civilizers, culture heroes, divine messengers, ancestors returning, visitors arriving from the sea, wise ones emerging from hiding. In Mesopotamian tradition, there are wise figures associated with teaching arts and sciences. In Mesoamerica, culture heroes bring agriculture and order. In the Andes, Viracocha is linked to restoration after flood. In ancient Egypt, Thoth embodies knowledge, measurement, writing. In Polynesian traditions, figures arrive carrying skills and rules across water. These teachers rarely invent knowledge from nothing. They restore it. They remind. They reorder. They bring structure back into a world described as chaotic. This framing matters because it suggests memory of a prior state where knowledge existed and was then disrupted. We do not need to interpret this literally as outsiders arriving with advanced technology. It can be understood socially. After disruption, certain individuals or groups retain fragments of older knowledge. Elders, specialists, survivors. When conditions stabilize, these people become sources of authority. Their knowledge feels ancient because it predates the rebuilt society around them. Myth transforms those dynamics into narrative. Specialists become semi-divine. Restoration becomes creation. Inheritance becomes revelation. Another recurring theme is the lost golden age, a time before the present described as more harmonious, longer-lived, closer to the gods, or more ordered. Hesiod's Ages of Man, the Hindu Yugas, indigenous stories of earlier peoples who lived differently, who held knowledge now gone, who occupied landscapes before they were reshaped. These aren't objective chronologies. They're reflections on change, on decline, on rupture, on the sense that something valuable slipped away. In societies that experienced repeated environmental disruption, that sense would not be purely philosophical. It would be rooted in lived loss, drowned places, vanished roots, forgotten practices, altered climates. One of the most important things myths do is encode knowledge indirectly. Environmental hazards become monsters. Seasonal cycles become gods. Astronomical patterns become stories of celestial beings. This isn't primitive misunderstanding. It's compression, a way to preserve complex information in a form that can be remembered, repeated, and adapted. A flood story may encode warnings about dangerous zones, seasonal timing, and the need for preparation. A story about a teacher may reinforce the value of listening to elders and preserving skills during times of change. A myth about a monster in a river may encode the river's unpredictability. In oral societies, myth is not just entertainment. It is infrastructure. It organizes memory where writing does not exist. And sometimes myths carry details that seem oddly specific. References to landscapes now underwater, to stars not visible from a current latitude, to long cycles that require generational observation. We should not treat these as literal coordinates, but we also should not dismiss them as meaningless. Anthropological work has shown that some oral traditions can preserve accurate information about events thousands of years old. Volcanic eruptions, sea level changes, embedded in symbolic language. Again, not every myth is a record, but myth as a category is too important to discard when we're dealing with deep time and missing evidence. When we view myths as memory rather than fiction, the unexplained gap changes shape. Instead of a pure silence, it becomes a murmur. Instead of absence, distortion. Instead of invention, inheritance reshaped by loss. And there is a reason the theme, "This is not the first world," appears so often. It reflects an intuitive recognition of discontinuity. Even early civilizations with writing and monuments often describe themselves as inheritors. Their origin stories place them after something, after chaos, after flood, after a prior age, after divine instruction. That is not necessarily literal history, but it is cultural self-understanding. And cultural self-understanding matters because it reveals how people experienced their own beginnings. They did not feel as if they were inventing everything from scratch. They felt as if they were picking up pieces. This aligns with the archaeological reality that many early civilizations build on older landscapes. They reuse sacred sites. They build atop earlier settlements. They incorporate pre-existing symbols. They situate themselves in places already thick with human presence. Civilization does not wipe the slate clean. It builds on what remains. So myths may function as bridges across resets, whether those resets were catastrophic, gradual, or cultural. They preserve identity through change. They explain why the world looks the way it does. They justify new structures while acknowledging loss. The echo of an earlier world doesn't require a vanished global empire. It requires something more ordinary and more human. Time disruption, memory, forgetting, and the stubborn need to explain where we came from when evidence no longer speaks clearly. And as we approach the end of this journey, there's one more cluster of unsettling material we should touch, because it sits right at the boundary where myth and measurement sometimes meet. Ancient maps, alignments, standardized measures, cases where early societies seem to know too much, too early. Not in a magical sense, but in a way that implies long observation and inherited frameworks that we struggle to place. In the next and final part, we'll move through those echoes of knowledge and then step back, far enough to see the whole landscape again, and ask what it means to stand between what was and what we remember. When people speak about ancient knowledge, the conversation often slides toward extremes. Either the past is credited with impossible technologies, or it is stripped of competence to keep the modern mind comfortable. What makes ancient maps, alignments, and measurements so unsettling is that they resist both impulses. They are real, they are measurable, and they often sit just far enough outside our expected story to create unease rather than certainty. The problem is not that ancient people knew nothing. It is that in several cases they appear to have known too much, too early, with a consistency that implies long observation rather than sudden inspiration. Maps are a good place to begin because they force clarity. A map either corresponds to geography or it doesn't. Interpretation matters, but orientation, proportion, and relationship can be tested. And what we find, again and again, is that early mapmaking is often less primitive sketching and more inherited framework. Even when a surviving map is not itself prehistoric, it often claims older sources. Medieval and early modern cartographers compiled earlier charts, copying, correcting, layering information from multiple traditions. That matters, because knowledge can travel forward without its original context. The map you see may be late, while the spatial knowledge inside it may be older than the ink that holds it. But even beyond famous debated examples, early civilizations display mapping competence in ways that require practice. Regional plans, boundary descriptions, river systems, trade routes, landscape codices that combine geography with political and sacred meaning. These are not naive doodles. They are tools, and tools imply a community that understands how to read them. Shared conventions, standardization, continuity. Mapping does not emerge from a single journey. It emerges from repeated movement through space, comparison, correction, and collective memory. When early civilizations already have functional mapping traditions, it suggests they inherited frameworks rather than inventing them fully formed. Alignments deepen the pattern. Across the world, ancient structures align with solstices and equinoxes, lunar standstills, stellar risings. This is not speculation. It is documented across continents. What is more difficult to explain is how often these alignments appear early, how precision shows up not as the final stage of refinement, but as part of the first visible stage. Aligning to a solstice requires more than noticing the sun once. You must observe extremes year after year, distinguish meaningful points from variation, maintain memory across seasons. Lunar cycles require even longer patience. The moon's major and minor standstill pattern spans about 18.6 years. Tracking that demands generational attention, and yet monuments encode these cycles as if they were familiar. The alignments are the final expression. The long watch that made them possible is rarely visible in artifacts. That watch likely lived in oral calendars, ritual timing, and specialized knowledge held by certain lineages. Knowledge that becomes archaeologically visible only when stone is arranged to hold it. Measurements carry the same signature. Standard units appear early, subdivided, repeatable, reliable. In ancient Egypt, the cubit is formalized and standardized. Large-scale construction shows precision that remains astonishing. Pyramids align closely to cardinal directions. Temple plans follow consistent proportions. This degree of accuracy requires more than craftsmanship. It requires measurement systems that can be reproduced reliably by many hands over time. It requires training, oversight, shared assumptions. Similar patterns appear elsewhere. Standardized brick dimensions across the Indus Valley, consistent architectural proportions across Mesoamerican centers, the precision of Andean stone fitting achieved without mortar. None of this requires a lost super technology. It requires continuity, time, practice, feedback. And that brings us back to the discomfort we started with. Why does so much appear fully formed? Why do we so often see final drafts rather than rough sketches? The most grounded answer is also the quietest, because learning does not reliably survive. Most knowledge lived in practice before it lived in things. Measuring rods made of wood decay. Astronomical instruction spoken at night vanishes when the speaker is gone. Mapping conventions taught through demonstration disappear when routes are abandoned. Social rules dissolve when contexts change. When early civilizations externalized knowledge, in stone alignments, written tallies, standardized measures, we finally get a durable snapshot. We finally see what had been happening quietly for a long time. In that sense, suddenness may be the moment of visibility, not the moment of invention. A second piece of the answer is fragility and bottlenecks. Knowledge can survive unevenly. A small group can preserve a tradition while others lose it. If that group later becomes influential, through migration, alliance, or demographic growth, the tradition can spread rapidly. Outsiders then see a leap. Insiders experience inheritance. And inheritance often travels without awareness. A society can use a calendar without remembering how many generations of watching were required to refine it. A builder can use a standard unit without knowing when it was first agreed upon. A community can perform rituals that encode environmental knowledge without understanding the original reason the ritual began. Knowledge survives because it works. Origins fade because survival prioritizes function over documentation. This is why early civilizations so often describe knowledge as received, taught by ancestors, delivered by divine figures, restored after chaos. Even if those stories are symbolic, their structure points to a real dynamic: continuity without clear origin stories, restoration after disruption, inheritance that feels older than the present world. Now, if we step back far enough, the landscape we've been walking through becomes visible as a whole. There is the deep prehistoric quiet, hundreds of thousands of years where intelligence is present but material traces are sparse. There is the stone record, precise, confident, often too mature to feel like first attempts. There are early monuments, time and meaning anchored in place before writing. There is agriculture, spreading fast, reshaping life, arriving with a competence that hints at long invisible rehearsal. There is the missing millennia, partly drowned, partly social, partly erased by instability and by the simple decay of perishable life. There is catastrophe and forgetting, not as a single event, but as a repeated force. There is myth, memory under pressure, insisting that this is not the first world. And there are the echoes of measurement and alignment, systems that imply long attention. And then there is us, listening, trying to reconstruct continuity from fragments. This is the moment that arrives quietly when you spend enough time looking backward. The realization that what we call history is not simply what happened, but what managed to remain visible long enough to be noticed. The gap between prehistory and civilization is not a hole in human experience. It is a mismatch between how humans learned and how evidence survives. Civilization did not emerge from ignorance. It emerged from familiarity, from thousands of generations of watching seasons, reading landscapes, shaping tools, negotiating social life, and carrying knowledge in bodies rather than archives. When conditions stabilized, when populations grew, those latent capacities found new outlets. They hardened into durable systems. Fields, walls, tablets, temples. That hardening made them visible. It also made them easier to lose in new ways, because external memory trades flexibility for permanence. It allows accumulation, but it also freezes systems that once adapted fluidly. It concentrates power. It creates inequality. It binds people to land and to institutions. It makes collapse dramatic when it comes. Prehistory was not a waiting room. It was a complete mode of being. Civilization did not arrive as a miraculous leap. It arrived as a visibility event and a reorganization, one that left louder traces than the quiet lives that made it possible. And here is the humbling part. Most of what shaped early human understanding is gone for good. Not hidden, not waiting for one perfect excavation, but eroded, submerged, decayed, forgotten. Coastlines drowned, languages vanished, teaching lineages broken. Entire worlds lived without leaving a durable signature. The gap is not something we will one day fill completely. And yet something remains. Patterns remain. Echoes remain. Not enough to give us a final answer, but enough to remind us that the story is deeper than the simplified version. That humans were thinking, measuring, observing, organizing, and remembering long before anyone wrote it down. Standing between what was and what we remember means accepting that history is incomplete by nature. Not because research has failed, but because time is an eraser, and most human life is made of materials that do not resist it. It also means resisting the urge to replace uncertainty with certainty too quickly. It is tempting to fill gaps with dramatic tales. Lost global empires, singular apocalyptic resets that explain everything. Sometimes those stories comfort us because they give shape to absence. But absence does not always have a single cause. Often it is built from thousands of small losses, decayed tools, drowned coastlines, forgotten rituals, collapsed experiments, abandoned routes, skills no longer needed. The quieter explanation is often the truer one. Humanity has always been capable, always observant, always adaptive, and knowledge has always been fragile. It was fragile when it lived only in people. It remains fragile now, even surrounded by digital archives, because systems fail and contexts vanish and skills fade when not practiced. The gap is not only about the past, it is also a mirror. A reminder that what we think is permanent rarely is. That inheritance happens without awareness. That forgetting is constant. That the future will misread us the way we misread the silent stretches of those who came before. If there is comfort here, it is not in a neat conclusion. It is in continuity without complete comprehension. In recognizing that even when records fail, the human tendency to observe, to organize, to share, and to search for meaning does not disappear. It changes form. It moves underground like a river, and it waits, as it always has, for the next stable moment where it can leave a mark long enough to be noticed again. This has been Echoes of the Forgotten Earth. Wherever you are, whatever time it is in your corner of the world, late, early, somewhere in between, Thank you for walking slowly through the gap with me. And if you ever feel the urge to rush past uncertainty, remember, the past has been patient. We can be too.